RicoR. I'm out here in the woods up on campus right now. And this is the official lyric video for my song Indian Eyes off of my album Message to the People. And I thought I'd make this just to kind of explain some of my lyrics. They're also on Genius. All of my songs are on Genius. But yeah, I just thought I'd make this. So without further ado, this is kind of a verbal explanation of Indian Eyes. They'll revolutionize, indigenize instead. Yeah, with Indian eyes. They'll revolutionize, indigenize instead. Yeah, with Indian eyes. So the concept of the song, they'll revolutionize, indigenize instead with Indian eyes. If you think about, look at my song breakdown video, I talk about this. We're living in a very Western-centric world, a world where it's very much about kind of what the next best thing is, creating a revolution, all of those concepts. And the song speaks out against that. It's basically, don't revolutionize means it's not about creating a revolution. Indigenize means going back to Western or going back to non-Western indigenous thinking. So, in essence, the chorus is, it's not about creating a revolution, it's about going back to our roots and going back to what indigenous thinking represents, and what that means. That's basically the chorus. So don't create a revolution, don't think about the next best thing, don't think about expansion and colonization, but just go back to indigenous thinking and community values and thinking about the other person, and that is the essence of the chorus. Now, I'm an indigenous boy, come to tell you a story about my life and perspective and all that glory. I grew up going to the church. My church was nature, and I think that definitely works. I have a very intimate relationship with nature since I was young, which is a part of a lot of indigenous cultures. I grew up going to nature, and for me, nature was oftentimes the place that I would go to pray, instead of a church. But for me, for Native and a lot of Native cultures, we don't have a real physical building called a church. We have our church is nature. And we use it in the same way that other major religions may use their church. We use nature in that way to pray, to do ceremony, to practice our ways and our kind of native identity in all those, whatever that may mean, all those different facets. But that is a church. So practicing our culture, nature is our church, and that's what that is talking about. When I was young, I grew up going to the lodge. The lodge was sacred more than just my cave, yo. I grew up going to the sweat lodge on a regular basis, and I did a coming of age ceremony when I turned 13, which for me was kind of my transition into manhood, and it was kind of a special landmark in that way for me, kind of going into manhood. But yeah, and so the sweat lodge has been a very special place for me, and kind of, I've been surrounded by natives that practice it very deeply and grew up going there. And for me, that's kind of a huge part of my culture. So that's what that means. And the lodge is a sacred space. It's not just a cave. It's a real ceremonial, spiritual space, which again, that misconception is very multi-layered, but that's kind of where that comes from. It is a sacred space. So that misconception says that it's not a sacred space. But that's what that is. The lodge was sacred more than just a cave. So there's a lot in there. But indigenous cultures, as I kind of touched on earlier, part of being native means that we are not really acknowledged, we're not really seen. And that's something I've had to deal with my whole life. Being misunderstood for being Native, people not really seeing me as Native because I look white, and people have a very strong misconception of what they think Indians should look like, and I don't fit that for many people. So uh, that's just been an issue throughout my life that I've had to deal with. Um, but going to nature for me um, really makes me feel more centered. And when I go to the land, everything really does feel better, and I'm able to deal with the hardships that come with being misunderstood as a native. When I go to nature, it helps me get rid of that, and really feel more grounded and feel more centered. Um, and I part of my culture as well. We have a very close relationship with animals, and animals are a huge part of our culture, and really seeing animals as equals. And when you speak to the animal sometimes helps you more than the human. When I have moments with my animals, or even just animals in nature, or my dad has had moments with animals in nature, there's a very strong sense of spirituality that comes out of that um, is very special. So that line, talk to the moose, talk to the deer, talk to the chimpanzee, feel their spirits and how they look at me. That connection is very important as a native person for me. So going to the land, going into nature, and just connecting with animals, that is one of the things that helps keep me grounded on a regular basis. And even if it's not really, I'm not even talking about necessarily snuggling all the time with the animal or whatever, but it's just going into nature and then just speaking to certain animals that um, is very special. That is very, very powerful. Um, and, the moose, the deer, and the chimpanzee are just three animals there, but there's so many other ones. And those are just examples. Um, And what I'm really getting at with that line more than anything is just that animals have a very specific role in indigenous cultures because we believe them to be equal to us, and they were here before us. So we're constantly thinking about them teaching us how to be, and teaching us how to be with the land and how to live. Um, and without that, it's very hard to live, almost impossible. Now, there have been many controversies regarding indigenous history. Some people say we don't exist. Greg Castro said it's rude of us to still exist. Some people say we're not as plentiful in the United States. They say there aren't that many at all. Some people say there weren't that many natives here at first contact. That is not a fact. So, I'm kind of going twofold here. But the first part of that is part of what it means to be native for me, in terms of the struggle of it, has been to have to educate my teachers and educate my peers about native identity, because the school systems in Western culture do not talk about indigenous history, um, and that is a huge problem, and something that you know we're still facing, and it's getting better in a lot of ways, but it's also not. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And I think there's always going to be more work that needs to be done. But right now, we're in a very, very special place where it's vitally important to educate about Native culture. It's very invisible um, overall in the school systems. Um, and, it's not the student's job to have to tell the teacher. It's not the student's job to have to tell the teacher um, you know, anything about history, or to have to educate. Like, they should be doing the work, and they don't, and a lot of people don't, and that's difficult. And Greg Castro is a friend of mine, and he has an article where he talks about how it's rude of us to still be here because the Western world doesn't really want us here. It's very rude of us to still be here. Um, but yeah. Another facet of that, among all the misconceptions of Native identity, is also the belief that, we existed, that we're in the past, the idea that we're in the past. um, and that there aren't that many of us here in the United States specifically, or anywhere, but you know, my experience has been as an American Indian, and it's really, there is a lot of misconceptions that there aren't that many of us here, and that there weren't that many of us at first contact, which is not even true because statistically there were a lot of natives here at first contact, and there are still, we're still very much alive, and people forget that, and that's so we have to constantly remind people that we're here, even people who should know better, and that's a very, very intense um, type of invisibility, I would say, and that's very difficult. Some people, way too much to bear, seem to claim that they don't really care about the facts and info. They don't know what they're in for after they start reading articles like Chuck's Sixth Anthro. Chuck Smith is another native scholar who has an article that he wrote for his Anthro 6 class, which is kind of a major article in a lot of indigenous education. And I read it in my dad's class, and it made an impact on me, along with Greg's article and some other ones. It's difficult because a lot of people around me don't care. That's another part of this whole conversation, is that, we are surrounded by a world that doesn't seem to care about natives. Um, from a on a political level, on a social level, there's a lot of elements there, but um, we're living in a world that doesn't care about us, and way too many people say that they just don't want to know, and they choose to remain ignorant. And it's really like my dad has had this experience where a lot of people come into his classes who don't know anything about Native history, and then they come out of it and just get a huge revelation because of all the things that they didn't know that they had to know. And so, that's where it's like way too much to bear. Um, Way too many people say that they don't care, but they don't know what they're in for after they, when they get educated, um, they all of a sudden come out of it realizing how valuable that information is. Um, So that's really important, and that's why we do what we do. Um, Trying to, as natives, kind of trying to create that visibility that we can, as much as we can, and yeah. And again, I mean, it's really a perspective changer. That's the other part of it. It's really a perspective changer. So when you end up getting the information that you need, it really changes your life for a lot of people. Because all this stuff is so underground and it's not being used by the mainstream. And so the experience of learning about Native education and our history, it makes an impact on people. The bottom line is that it should be considered a crime not to study Native ways somewhere along the line, because once you do, then you will see there were more than just cavemen bumping into redwood trees. The only other thing I'll say about this is I'll explain where it's from, because Karina Gould is a major figure in Native studies, and she did a speech at UCSC one time where she jokingly said that people thought that natives were just bumping into redwood trees at first contact, and that's very, it was funny, and it's also sadly very true, because that whole primitive image that I mentioned earlier, it's very prevalent, it's very real. So that's where that comes from. It's really, and it's, it's a dark kind of humor, because you imagine, like, our civilizations are actually very complex, and I'm not even really going to use the word civilizations, they're more like cultures. A lot of these cultures are very complex. We have a very complex religion and way of thinking, and we've been downsized and we've been downgraded over centuries into these primitive beings and being kind of like apes, you know. So that's where that comes from. So that was referring specifically to the California Indians, of course, the redwood trees. But yeah, just that we were acting like monkeys and apes which of course are our ancestors, but and even apes and monkeys are smarter than the mainstream gives them credit for. So, but yeah. Hey guys, it's RicoR. Thank you guys so much for watching this Genius analysis video. Please be sure to check out the Genius lyric site alongside it, link below this video, where there's written versions of a lot of the stuff I'm talking about in the video, as well as some stuff that's not in the video. And also please be sure to check out the original studio recordings. Thank you guys so much, and cheers.